Welcome to Verum Memorare. This is a project really dedicated to uncovering some forgotten but absolutely essential wisdom from Christian practice. If you're someone who's curious, maybe intensely curious, about how deep theological tradition connects with, well, hard modern science, think neuroscience, acoustics, even physiology, then you're definitely in the right place.
Yeah, our mission here with Verum Memorare, it's quite an undertaking, isn't it? We're diving deep into these sacred practices, and we're looking specifically through the lens of, let's say, pre-Vatican II Christian tradition. It's rich, often overlooked. But we're also bringing in contemporary research, using it to confirm, maybe explain, just from an empirical view, why these ancient ways worked, why they were so powerful for, well, body and soul.
Right. And we've identified 7 core areas that our sources keep pointing to. They call it a sacramental ecology of the body and soul, which is quite a phrase. We're talking about things like silence, repetition, fasting, sound, body posture, lighting and darkness, even scent or olfaction. It's really an exploration into how our physical engagement with the divine actually changes us. Spiritually, yes, but maybe even biologically.
It's a huge landscape, absolutely. But you have to start somewhere, right? And the starting point, the foundation. Arguably the element most, well, damaged, perhaps, by modern liturgical changes, modern culture even, is silence.
So that's our focus today, a deep, detailed exploration, the role and power of silence. We've got a wealth of material, scientific, historical. And we want to start with a key distinction right off the bat. Because silence, the way tradition understood it, it's not just, the lack of noise.
That's absolutely critical. It's the hinge for this whole discussion. Theologically, our sources insist silence is an absence. It's defined as the presence of receptivity. It's active. It's about consciously creating this interior space, not emptiness, no, but fertile ground, prepared specifically for adoration, for contemplation, for awe. It's the setup, the condition needed for encountering the transcendent.
It's like finally stopping talking so you can actually start listening. Okay, let's unpack this then. Using that dual lens we talked about, theology and liturgy first, then the hard science that kind of backs it up.
Okay, so from the biblical angle, silence is deeply tied to God revealing himself. The classic example, everyone goes to it, is Elijah, 1 Kings 19.
Right, where he's on Mount Horeb, hiding out, and there's this whole dramatic sequence. It seems designed to show something about God's presence.
Exactly. The text says the Lord passes by. There's this huge wind tearing mountains apart. But God's not in the wind. Then an earthquake. Still, God's not in the earthquake. Then fire. God's not in the fire either. After all that noise, that power, that spectacle, the resolution comes. God speaks in a still, small voice.
Sometimes translated as, what, the sound of sheer silence or a light whisper? The implication is huge. The big, loud, sensory stuff isn't where you find God fully. It's in the quiet. The stillness. That quiet seems to be the prerequisite for hearing the divine voice.
And that attitude, that active listening, that stillness, it runs all through the older devotional writings. Think about Psalm 62.1. For God alone my soul waits in silence. The Hebrew word there. It implies waiting, yes, but also resting, being still. It's an act of trust, really, a posture of expectation. It's not just putting up with quiet. It's actively setting your soul up to receive whatever God might offer.
Okay, so how did the church traditionally kind of institutionalize that, especially before Vatican II?
Well, historically, this idea, you see it in Eastern Christianity, too. They call it hesychia, meaning stillness, that spiritual silence of the heart. This was really the backbone of monastic life. And it was deeply embedded in the public liturgy as well, the Tridentine Rite, particularly the Low Mass. That silence wasn't just accidental, It was structured, deliberate. It was meant to let the soul kind of disconnect from all the sensory noise of the world and tune into the divine mystery happening right there on the altar.
I can almost picture that intentional heavy silence, maybe during the canon of the Mass. But you mentioned, and our sources definitely note this, a big shift after Vatican II, less silence, more verbal participation, more community interaction. What drove that change, and what's the critique?
Well, the intention behind the liturgical movement and the council's reforms, it was genuinely good. They wanted to foster actuosa participatio, real, genuine engagement from the laity. And often the way that happened was translating prayers into the vernacular, encouraging people to say responses out loud, sing more, interact more. The goal was admirable, make the Mass feel less passive for people.
But the sources seem to suggest there was a downside. An unintended consequence to pushing for all that external activity.
Absolutely. The critique that emerges is that this focus on the horizontal, person-to-person interaction, audible stuff, It inadvertently, perhaps, dulled the mystical dimension.
Yeah.
When there's constant input, talking, singing, explaining everything, it just crowds out the space you need for awe, for that sense of mystery, that vertical axis, the tremendum et fascinans, that awesome, terrifying, fascinating mystery of God's presence. It starts to fade when there's constant noise. It gets replaced by something more, well, social, more man-centered.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're always being told what to say or do next, you kind of stop listening for what the silence itself might be trying to tell you. Which brings us, really fascinatingly, to the science. It seems like science is now validating these spiritual principles that monks and mystics figured out centuries ago just through practice.
It's quite revolutionary, actually, the neurological evidence. When we stop doing goal-oriented tasks like talking or reading or analyzing stuff outside of us, the brain actually shifts gears. It activates what's called the default mode network, or DMN.
Okay, the DMN. For those of us not deep into neuroscience, that sounds technical. What exactly is happening in this default mode? Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. Think of the DMN as maybe your brain's internal operating system. It's deep background processing. It lights up when you're quiet, maybe just staring out the window or meditating, not focused on an external task.
Right.
And this network, this circuitry, it's directly linked to some really critical high-level functions, things like self-reflection, integrating who you are, memory consolidation, making sense of your past, even future planning, and significantly moral reasoning.
Yeah.
So if you're constantly hit with external stimuli, noise, screens, endless conversation, the DMN can't really switch on properly. You end up stuck in this kind of reactive surface level state. Silence is basically the on switch for that deep internal work.
So that hesychia, that interior stillness, it's not just some lofty spiritual goal. It's actually a neurological requirement for self-awareness, for putting the pieces together.
Precisely. Without silence, we don't get the cognitive rest needed to process our experiences, to form real self-knowledge. But the benefits go beyond just thinking deeply. They're physiological, too.
Right, and this is where it connects to stress, physical health. Silence isn't just good for your soul's depth, it's literally good for your body.
It's genuinely medicinal.
Yeah.
We have studies confirming that periods of silence actively lower cortisol levels, the main stress hormone, the one behind fight or flight. And beyond that, silence seems to increase neuroplasticity. That's the brain's amazing ability to change, to reorganize itself, form new connections. Basically, silence makes your brain better at learning and adapting.
And there's specific research backing this up.
Okay.
You mentioned Luciano Bernardi's 2013 study. What was the key finding there, comparing silence to sound?
Bernardi's work was very specific, very revealing. He had people listen to different kinds of music, classical, more modern stuff, and measured their physical responses. Heart rate, breathing, blood pressure. The surprising thing, just 2 minutes of simple, unstructured silence produced greater physiological relaxation than any of the music they played. Even the stuff everyone considers calming, like classical music.
Wow. So even supposedly relaxing music is still input. Something the brain has to process, keeping the nervous system a bit active, whereas silence lets it truly power down.
That seems to be the mechanism. Silence led to lower blood pressure, slower, deeper breathing. It activated the parasympathetic nervous system, our rest and digest system, more effectively than any sound stimulus did. It really confirms that taking away auditory input helps us focus internally and fights off what some psychologists call attention residue, that mental clutter from our hyperstimulated lives.
The Desert Fathers really knew what they were doing, didn't they?
Right.
And they didn't need fMRI scans to figure it out. That connection is powerful.
Okay, so if we accept that silence is neurologically good for us, and theologically it creates receptivity, we have to bring this to the absolute center of Catholic spiritual life. How does silence help us become more aware of Christ's real presence, specifically in the Eucharist? This takes us beyond the general benefits of quiet, into the very specific experience of sacred mystery.
And we have to start with the theology here, right? The core Catholic teaching.
Yeah.
The Eucharist is truly, really substantially Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity.
That doctrine, which the Council of Trent really hammered home, insists that this reality is mystical. It's not something you perceive with your senses. It still looks like bread, tastes like wine. If it was sensible, if you could just see it or taste it, you wouldn't need faith. The whole point, in a way, is that the senses are deceived so that faith can step in and grasp the truth.
Okay, so if our senses are meant to be bypassed, in a sense, then noise, which is all sensory input, must actually distract from that necessary act of faith.
Exactly. Silence becomes the way the soul says yes to that mystery. It's adoring without constantly needing to analyze or describe what's happening with words. Silence basically says, my mind can't grasp this fully, so I have to receive it with my heart in stillness.
This reminds me of St. John of the Cross. He
Yeah.
lived this interior silence. There's a quote, I think it captures this idea perfectly, especially regarding the Eucharist.
Which one are you thinking of? He wrote so powerfully on this.
The one about the Father speaking one word.
Ah, yes. The Father spoke one word, which was his Son, and this word he always speaks in eternal silence, and in silence must it be heard by the soul. It suggests the highest communication, the divine word itself, isn't transmitted like human language. It's this constant, eternal, nonverbal act. So the soul has to adopt that same medium silence to even begin to hear it. Silence isn't a lack of communication. It's the only language capable of receiving the infinite.
So how did this play out historically in the liturgy? The contrast between the older Mass and many modern ones seems really stark here. Tell us about that intentional hush in the pre-Vatican II Mass.
Well, the traditional Latin Mass, especially the Low Mass, was meticulously designed to create and protect silence during the absolute core of the sacrifice. During the canon, the Eucharistic prayer, the priest would whisper the words of consecration. This wasn't accidental, it was profoundly intentional. It kind of mirrored the intimacy, the sacred privacy of the Last Supper. It acknowledged that this moment belonged uniquely to Christ and the priest acting in persona Christi, in the person of Christ.
And for the people kneeling in the pews, what was that experience like?
Overwhelmingly, it was a palpable hush, a heavy silence. There was no background music usually, no running commentary, no loud readings during that specific time. After the elevation of the host in the chalice, which might be marked by bells, the church would remain in profound silence, often for a noticeable period. That was the moment of tremendum et fascinans, the awesome and fascinating mystery made present. The silence itself felt like a unifying force, creating reverence that didn't need words.
That sounds like an environment perfectly set up for that DMN activation we discussed. Deep, sustained internal processing of something sacred happening right there.
It absolutely was. Now contrast that. Think about many modern services. In the Post-Vatican II liturgy, the Eucharistic prayer is said entirely aloud, often amplified through microphones, and our sources point out this is frequently accompanied by soft background music, maybe keyboard noodling, ambient noise. If silence is scheduled, it often feels short, maybe even a bit awkward, or it gets quickly filled by the priest or a musician jumping in.
In communion time, arguably the most personal moment of encounter is almost always filled with hymns, right? Which requires you to focus externally, sing along.
Which makes that quiet, personal adoration, that absorption of the divine encounter, almost impossible for many people. The unintended effect of saying the sacred words loudly, explaining everything constantly, it has, for some, demystified the consecration. When that vertical sense of awe gets replaced by constant talking and social activity, the mystery can feel diluted. People might start focusing more on what the community is doing rather than what God is doing.
This seems to be why Eucharistic adoration is making such a comeback. It's where that traditional silence is preserved, even amplified.
Adoration is silence made tangible. It's an invitation to absolute stillness before the exposed Blessed Sacrament. And people who practice it consistently, they report radical shifts. They talk about time slowing down internally, an intense feeling of being watched, not in a creepy way, but a sense of presence, accountability, and often deep clarity, peace cutting through the mental noise.
Our sources describe the silence in adoration as, a presence thick, fertile, heavy with invisible gravity. Can you elaborate on that weight? That sounds counterintuitive for silence.
It means the silence doesn't feel like nothingness. It feels like substance. It has density. It has presence. In that quiet, the real presence is felt viscerally, beyond just intellectual belief. The silence itself points to the mystery. It prepares the soul to perceive what the senses miss. It really underlines that losing silence isn't just losing quiet time. It's losing the very condition needed to encounter the supernatural effectively.
So if silence is the key to unlocking the mystery, what's the spiritual cost when we lose it in the main liturgy?
The sources suggest the cost is high. When the liturgy loses its sacred silence, well, the mystery can start to feel like a performance. Adoration turns into distraction. The sacrifice might feel reduced to just a community meal or a symbolic get-together. It flattens that vertical dimension. The Mass risks shifting from sacred to social and, consequently, from God-centered back to being man-centered. Without that structured space for awe, it's hard for people to grasp that something truly, unspeakably sacred is happening.
That critique, the God-centered to man-centered shift, leads us straight into the next really critical area. We need to challenge this modern assumption that, that doing is always better than just being. that speaking is always deeper than listening.
Exactly. This gets to the heart of how we even define active participation. Historically, spiritually, engagement wasn't just about making noise or being busy. Think about Mary at the cross. She's silent. She's still. Yet, who is more profoundly engaged in that pivotal moment of history?
Right. And as you mentioned, even in the ancient liturgies, the core prayers, like the Eucharistic prayer, were for the priest. The people participated differently.
Yes, their participation was through their posture, their inner disposition, their silent offering of themselves alongside the sacrifice. It was an offering of the heart, the will, the focused mind, not necessarily the volume of their voice. The big confusion seems to stem from interpreting that Latin phrase, actuosa participatio, from Sacrosanctum Concilium, paragraph 14.
Actuosa, which means actual or engaged, right?
Okay.
But how did that get translated or maybe mistranslated in practice over the years?
While it means actual or real engagement, the way it was often implemented focused almost entirely on what you could see and hear. It became equated with external participation, singing, saying responses, being a lector, joining committees, all good things, but the deep interior engagement got sidelined because it wasn't easily measured or seen.
And this is where Pope Benedict XVI's clarification was so important. He saw this misinterpretation happening.
He did. Benedict addressed it directly. He said true active participation had been misunderstood. He stated quite clearly, active participation is not about exterior activity. It is about interior union with the prayer and action of Christ. That completely reframes it, doesn't it? It puts the main focus back on the will, the heart, the soul's connection, not just the external actions.
That is a massive distinction. It really redefines what it means to pray the Mass well. Can we break down the difference between interior and exterior participation a bit more practically for listeners?
Sure. Exterior or verbal participation is the stuff we can easily see and hear. Saying the amens, singing the hymns, maybe being an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion. It's the visible side of worship. Necessary, but not the whole picture.
Okay, and interior participation, the silent part.
That's the absorption, the inner work. It's meditating on the mystery of transubstantiation as it happens. It's silently offering up your own struggles, your joys, uniting them with Christ's sacrifice. It's contemplating the real presence within you after communion, without needing music or words to fill the space. The problem, as our sources identify it, is when the push for constant verbalization becomes almost compulsive, a kind of liturgical hyperactivity that drowns out the possibility of contemplative depth. Making noise doesn't automatically equal devotion. Sometimes the noise is the barrier.
We should link this back to the science again. You mentioned brainwaves earlier. Verbal activity keeps the brain in a specific state, right? One that's not ideal for deep reflection.
Exactly. We're talking about brainwave states. When you're actively speaking, analyzing text, reading aloud, reacting to external cues, your brain is mainly humming along in beta waves. Beta waves are high frequency, they're associated with alertness, focus on the outside world, problem solving, getting tasks done, great for driving, not so great for contemplation.
And what happens neurologically when we introduce sustained silence, when we encourage that interior focus?
The brain naturally slows down. It shifts into alpha and then potentially theta waves. Alpha waves are linked to calm focus, relaxation, creativity, that in-the-zone feeling. Theta waves are even slower. They're directly associated with deep meditation, emotional processing, insight, and those states sometimes described as mystical awareness.
So the constant verbal stimulus in some modern liturgies, the announcements, the background music, the back and forth responses, it's scientifically keeping our brains in beta mode. A mode that's fundamentally less suited for the deep spiritual insight and union the liturgy is supposed to facilitate.
That seems to be the mechanism. It's what we could call the clutter effect. It keeps the left brain dominant, the analytical language part, which is vital, of course, but it crowds out the right brain's functions. Intuition, holistic awareness, nonverbal awe. The potential result of too much verbalization is a kind of spiritual fatigue. Faith becomes more intellectualized. The sense of mystery fades because the focus stays on the process, the words, the actions, rather than the presence they point to.
That's a serious point. It suggests the way we structure worship might sometimes inadvertently hinder the very encounter it's meant to create. So how do we fix this? How do we restore authentic engagement, reclaim silence as participation?
Well, the sources suggest a two-pronged approach: education and structure.
Yeah.
First, we need catechesis. We have to teach people explicitly that interior silence is participation, powerful participation. And second, we need structural reform. We need to intentionally build structured silence back into the Mass, not just hoping it happens, but scheduling it.
Like specific defined pauses.
Exactly. Maybe a solid 5 minutes of silence after the readings, letting the word actually sink in. A pause after the homily for personal reflection. And critically, a mandated, respected period of deep silence after communion. These aren't empty gaps. They need to be presented as invitations to stillness, to digest the spiritual food received.
And teaching people that being silent is active. It's wordless worship, as you put it.
Yes. And liturgical choices matter too. Things like encouraging ad orientem worship priests and people facing God together can subtly shift the focus from the community looking at itself back towards the transcendent. Maybe reining in musical oversaturation, ensuring music supports contemplation instead of drowning out internal prayer. True active participation, as Benedict suggested, is measured by how deeply and quietly you connect with Christ, not just how loudly you sing the closing hymn.
That moment of internal union really does seem to require internal quiet.
Okay, we've talked about the silence inside us, and the silence, or lack thereof, in the liturgical actions. Now let's zoom out. Let's look at the container itself, the church building. How does the physical space help or hinder silence? This brings us to architectural theology.
Architecture as theology. I love that idea. The building itself teaches.
It absolutely does. There's that principle, lex orandi, lex credendi, lex edificandi. The law of prayer shapes the law of belief, which shapes the law of building. Architecture isn't just about looks or function, it's a theological statement. It's like a physical user manual for the soul. And older, traditional sacred architecture was often brilliantly designed not just to hold people, but to psychologically, even acoustically, nudge them towards silence and awe.
Let's start with the elements that amplify silence. Verticality seems key. That feeling when you walk into a huge Gothic cathedral.
Yes. High ceilings, that soaring vertical thrust. It does something psychologically. It tends to suppress the urge to chatter. When the ceiling is 80 feet up, you feel physically smaller, your ego shrinks a bit, and your voice naturally lowers. Your eyes, your whole spirit get drawn upwards. It emphasizes transcendence, God's otherness, rather than the horizontal, the human community around you. It creates a sense of spiritual possibility and encourages restraint.
And the acoustics. Modern buildings often try to deaden sound, kill echoes. But traditional ones embrace them, right?
They absolutely did. Stone, brick, high-vaulted ceilings, they create an acoustically live space. Lots of reverberation. Sound bounces around. And that wasn't seen as a flaw, it was a feature. Our sources describe it as something that punishes loudness. If you talk loudly or too quickly in a place like Chartres Cathedral, the sound is amplified, it echoes, it sounds messy, it draws attention. The space itself encourages slow, measured speech, or even better, silence. The architecture acts like a volume knob, inviting stillness.
So the building itself is teaching reverence through sound. If you're too loud, it sounds bad, basically.
Precisely. It's sensory feedback. And another key element is focus. Traditional churches usually funnel your attention towards one main point, the high altar, the tabernacle, maybe a prominent crucifix. When your eyes are drawn to a single sacred focal point, it's easier for the mind to settle into contemplative silence compared to a space that's visually cluttered or pulls your attention sideways.
We also need to talk about light and shadow, the atmosphere. How does that dim, warm, maybe candlelit feel compared to bright, even electric lighting?
Dim, warm, or filtered light, think stained glass, tends to enhance calm and contemplation. It creates subtle shifts, shadows, a dynamic interplay of light and dark. It evokes mystery, the hiddenness of God, maybe God gradually revealed. That kind of lighting tends to foster those calming alpha brainwaves. Full-on, bright electric light, on the other hand. It stimulates alertness, encourages interaction, speech. It's great for an office or a classroom, but less ideal for a sanctuary meant for encountering mystery.
Okay, now the flip side. What architectural elements tend to undermine silence? Starting with those modern, often multi-purpose, auditorium-style church designs.
Right. These often flatten the verticality. Lower ceilings, wide layouts, maybe semicircular seating. They're frequently designed for horizontal focused people seeing each other easily. This naturally encourages social interaction, conversation, focusing on the community rather than the transcendent. They often prioritize comfort and accessibility, which, while good in themselves, can sometimes work against creating that necessary sense of awe or otherness.
And the acoustics in these spaces usually go the opposite way too, aiming for clarity of speech above all.
Exactly. Lots of sound-absorbing materials, carpets, acoustic tiles, drywall, lower ceilings. They create acoustic deadness. Sound dies quickly. It feels more like a lecture hall or a conference room where conversation is easy and expected. People feel more comfortable talking because their voices don't carry or echo in a way that feels disruptive. Trying to impose silence in a space like that often feels forced, like fighting the room itself rather than flowing naturally from it.
And lastly, what about all the technology we often see integrated now? Microphones, speakers everywhere, screens, monitors.
Technology inherently tends to reinforce the horizontal and the analytical. Microphones make it easy for everyone to be heard loudly, overriding any natural acoustic invitation to quietness. Screens and monitors add visual noise, pulling the eye away from sacred symbols, reinforcing the idea that you're there to receive information, data, rather than experience a mystery beyond words. It can unintentionally desacralize the space, replacing the potential quiet whisper of God with amplified human voices, sometimes even digitally mediated ones.
So architectural silence seems built on some core principles. Using height to make the human feel small and the divine feel large. Using acoustics, psychoacoustics, to naturally discourage loudness and encourage reflection. That makes sense, doesn't it?
Absolutely. A reverberant cathedral makes fast, loud talking physically difficult and sound unpleasant. Psychologically, height promotes feelings of freedom and awe, while boxy, low rooms can feel more controlling, more geared for discussion. Architectural silence is really about using sensory cues to shape our inner state, to make the body feel appropriately small and the soul feel appropriately open before the sacred. The traditional church building was often a masterclass in teaching reverence without saying a word.
Okay, that look at architecture really drives home the point that silence isn't passive. It's something you actively cultivate, even with bricks and mortar. Now, let's synthesize the science again, maybe take it to its deepest point, and connect it to where our culture is right now. Because that data on neurogenesis, that's possibly the most startling piece of this whole puzzle.
Yes, let's revisit that. The 2013 mouse study by Inke Kirst. It wasn't just showing that silence is relaxing or restorative. It showed silence is actively regenerative at the cellular level in the brain.
Remind us exactly what was happening in the hippocampus, that key brain region during those silent periods.
Kirst found that exposing mice to just 2 hours of silence a day actually promoted the growth of new brain cells neurogenesis, specifically in the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is crucial. It's central for memory formation, for learning new things, for regulating emotions, even for navigating space.
So silence isn't just letting the mind rest. It's literally helping the mind rebuild itself, increasing its capacity for complex thought, emotional balance, learning new habits.
That's what the evidence suggests. It implies that your ability to form new memories, maybe learn new spiritual practices like contemplation, or even just manage your emotions better, that capacity might literally be strengthened and restored by regular silence. When you combine that with Bernardi's findings, lower cortisol, lower blood pressure, more rest and digest activity, you get a powerful scientific picture. Silence isn't just nice, it's a form of biological nourishment. It sets the stage for focused perception, for deep psychological presence. Without it, the brain can get stuck in that superficial beta wave loop.
Which brings us to this huge cultural irony. Our sources really highlight this. Modern people seem desperately hungry for the very silence and transcendence the church traditionally offered, but they're often looking for it outside the church walls now.
They are. They're escaping the noise, the complexity, the constant demands of modern life and secular spaces. They head for the mountains, the ocean, deep forests. They're seeking stillness, simplicity, something transcendent, you could call it. Maybe religious instincts searching for expression, but without the religious context they once had. People feel something in the silence of nature, a sense of awe, maybe something they'd even call divine.
Nature has become the substitute cathedral, in a way, because the actual cathedrals sometimes feel more like community centers now.
That's the tough irony, isn't it? A well-designed traditional church actually mimics some key elements of nature. Stone vaults like mountains, filtered light like a forest, reverberation like a canyon. But if the worship service inside that building has stripped away the structured silence, the sense of mystery, the awe, perhaps in an attempt to be more accessible or explanatory, then the building itself, the silent stones, can end up being a more powerful preacher than the liturgy happening within it.
Let's focus on that sharpest irony you mentioned earlier, the reversal.
The reversal is this. Someone, maybe a tourist or just a seeker, walks into an old historic Catholic church that's now basically treated as a museum. It's empty, quiet. And they might have a more profound sense of mystical presence, of awe, than they would attending a noisy, highly verbal, modern mass in a different church down the street.
Why does the museum space speak louder in that case?
Because the silence speaks volumes where perhaps the words have become too many or too commonplace. The architecture itself, the weight of history in the stones, the play of light, the acoustic memory of centuries of quiet prayer. It evangelizes the soul almost instantly, non-verbally. That absence of noise allows a direct, visceral awareness of the sacred that an over-verbalized, hyper-stimulated worship service can, completely unintentionally, obscure. The place built for worship becomes a silent museum exhibit of the spiritual sense it was meant to nurture, while the act of worship risks becoming just a social event.
It really seems like the modern soul is instinctively craving the very conditions science says are good for us. Silence, vastness, stillness, that DMN activation, maybe even neurogenesis, conditions that contemporary liturgy in its pursuit of relevance or engagement has sometimes discarded.
And we have to see that craving as a spiritual hunger. People aren't looking for less awe, less mystery. They're usually looking for more. If the church wants to respond effectively to this deep-seated need, the answer isn't less silence, less awe, less mystery. It's probably more. A restored environment where encountering the real presence and stillness is not just possible, but actively facilitated.
The ultimate claim here, pulling it all together from our sources, is pretty breathtaking. Nature can give us a taste of peace, a shadow of Eden, maybe restore the body temporarily.
But liturgical silence, silence deliberately structured around the real presence, aims higher. It doesn't just restore the body, it potentially opens a door towards the New Jerusalem. If the Mass can recover its sacred, structured silence, it could once again become what people are searching for. The mountain, the sea, and the still small voice all in one. That silence is maybe where the deepest connection happens, where the cosmos comes home for rest, you might say. #Chag outro.
Wow. That was an incredibly rich and, I have to say, pretty challenging exploration of silence. It really establishes it, doesn't it, as foundational, a prerequisite for a deep, integrated spiritual life, and backed up by both tradition and neuroscience.
Yeah, just to quickly recap the core takeaways. First, silence isn't empty. It's that active receptivity. It's needed for our brains, for that DMN to kick in, and for the soul to actually hear the divine word, as St. John of the Cross put it. Second, it seems essential for truly discerning the real presence, moving the Eucharist from maybe just routine into a moment of real, profound, wordless awe.
Right. And third, that silence needs support. It needs structure in the liturgy, yes, but also in the architecture. The science confirms it heals the brain, promotes neurogenesis, and our culture confirms people are desperately seeking it.
And this is just the beginning for Verum Memorare. Step 1 in restoring the sacramental ecology. We've got 6 more areas lined up.
Next time, we're going to pivot. From the stillness of silence to something that seems almost opposite, but is just as crucial in ancient devotion. The role and power of repetition in prayer. We'll look at things like the Rosary, the Divine Office, the Jesus Prayer. And again, ask, what does science say about neural pathways, memory, maybe even the trance-like states that patterned language can induce?
But before you jump back into the noise of the world, maybe just one final thought to chew on from today's deep dive. If the cosmos might just come home when the church is silent, what's 1 minute? Just one truly silent minute, phone off, no tasks that you could intentionally carve out today, just to make a little space for that kind of encounter.
Thank you so much for joining us for this exploration with Verum Memorare. We're really looking forward to continuing this recovery of sacred wisdom with you next time.